The air on the ridge did not smell of rain, though the heavens had opened hours ago. It smelled of wet wool, spent gunpowder, and the thick copper tang of blood. On the 16th of May, 1811, a day that should have been a rout became a legend, etched not in the annals of strategy, but in the sheer bloody obstinacy of the British soldier. Before we step onto that crimson mud, I invite you to join our ranks by subscribing to the channel, ensuring these forgotten chronicles of courage and sacrifice are never lost to the mists of time. To understand the horror of Albuera, one must first strip away the romantic paintings of the era. There were no orderly lines, no pristine uniforms gleaming in the sunlight. There was only a suffocating gray mist, clinging to the Spanish hillsides like a shroud, obscuring the terrifying shapes of the enemy until they were mere paces away. It was a chaotic claustrophobic nightmare where death arrived unseen, announced only by the wet thud of lead against flesh or the terrifying shrill neigh of a maimed horse. On this god-forsaken ridge, the British army was not winning. In fact, by all conventions of warfare, they were already defeated. The right flank had been shattered, caught unprepared by a masterstroke of French tactical genius. The Spanish allies, brave but confused, were jammed together in a disordered mass, unable to fire, while the sky turned dark with the smoke of 1,000 muskets. Through the gloom, the terrifying silhouette of the polished lancers, Napoleon's ruthlessly efficient horsemen, could be seen spearing men as they ran, their long lances dripping with the cost of panic. Disaster was not approaching, it had arrived. The entire Allied position was on the brink of total collapse. If the line broke here, the army would be cut in half, the road to Portugal would be thrown open, and the war against the Corsican tyrant might well be lost in a single afternoon. Standing directly in the path of this oncoming hurricane was the 57th Regiment of Foot. They were the West Middlesex, a solid, unremarkable unit of line infantry. They were not the celebrated Guards, nor the dashing Rifles. They were ordinary men laborers, farmhands, and tradesmen from the home counties, dressed in faded brick-red coats that were now heavy with rain and sweat. But on this ridge, they were the only thing standing between the British army and annihilation. They stood in a line, 2 ranks deep, facing a French column that outnumbered them vastly. The enemy was the cream of Marshal Soult's army, veterans who had marched across Europe, toppling kingdoms and crushing empires. These French troops were buoyed by the momentum of victory, their drums beating a rhythmic pulse of intimidation, their officers screaming, "Vive l'Empereur," as they ascended the slope. The fire that struck the 57th was described by those who survived it as a tempest of iron. At a range of fewer than 30 paces, the French musketry was not a battle, it was an execution. Men did not fall individually, they fell in clusters, entire files wiped out in the blink of an eye. The regimental colors, the sacred soul of the battalion, fell time and again, only to be snatched up from the mud by another hand before the silk touched the ground. Ensigns, mere boys of 16 or 17, were cut down clutching the heavy poles, their first and last taste of war being the bitter dust of Albuera. Yet the line did not break, it did not even bend. In the center of this maelstrom stood Lieutenant Colonel William Inglis. He was a veteran officer, a man of Scottish descent with a reputation for being stern but fair. He was not a man given to speeches or theatrical displays. He was a soldier of the old school, believing that an officer's place was not in the safety of the rear, but beside his men sharing the same danger, breathing the same smoke. As the French volleys tore through the ranks, a charge of grape shot, a cluster of iron balls fired from a cannon like a giant shotgun, struck Inglis. The impact was catastrophic. It slammed into his chest, shattering ribs and collapsing his lung, the force of the blow knocking him backward into the bloody mire. By the logic of self-preservation, his war was over. His aides rushed to him, frantic to carry him to the surgeons in the rear, to drag him away from the slaughterhouse that the ridge had become. But Inglis, gasping for air, blood bubbling at his lips, shook his head. He knew the fragile psychology of the battlefield. He knew that if the men saw their commander carried away, their resolve might fracture. In the confusion of smoke and death, the sight of a retreating leader is often the spark that ignites a panic. He refused to be moved. Instead, he ordered 2 of his men to prop him up. He wanted to sit there, in front of the colors, in the very teeth of the enemy fire. He wanted his men to see him. With a strength born of sheer will, fighting the agony that threatened to pull him into unconsciousness, he raised his voice above the roar of the muskets and the screams of the dying. He did not call for retreat. He did not call for assistance. He shouted the words that would burn themselves into the history of the British Army. "Die hard, 57th! Die hard!" It was a grim command. He was not promising them victory. He was not promising them glory or salvation. He was asking them to do the hardest thing a soldier can be asked to do, to stand still and die so that the line might hold. He was asking them to trade their lives for time, and they listened. The men of the West Middlesex, seeing their colonel bleeding but unbowed, closed their ranks. As a man fell, the soldier to his left or right stepped into the gap, maintaining the perfect dressing line discipline of the parade ground amidst the carnage of hell. They did not fire wildly, they fired with the rhythmic, mechanical precision of the British infantryman load, present, fire, load, present, fire. They became a machine of resistance, a red wall that the French wave crashed against again and again, but could not erode. This was not the dashing heroism of a cavalry charge. This was something deeper, something quieter and more terrible. It was the stoic refusal to yield to the impossible. It was a regiment committing collective suicide rather than accept the shame of surrender. But to understand how they reached this moment, how a group of ordinary men could possess such extraordinary ironclad discipline, we must look back. We must step away from the blood-soaked ridge of Albuera and understand the world that forged them. We must look at the global chessboard of 1811, where Britain stood alone against a continent united under the French eagle. We must understand the stakes of a war where defeat meant not just the loss of a battle, but the potential invasion of England itself. To appreciate the miracle of the diehards, we must first understand the shadow of the man they were fighting against, not the French soldiers on the hill, but the Corsican genius in Paris who had set the world ablaze. We must look at the Spanish ulcer that was slowly draining the lifeblood of the French Empire, and the desperate, high-stakes gamble that led two armies to collide in the mist on a morning in May. The story of the 57th is not just about one afternoon of slaughter. It is the story of a regiment, an army, and a nation that simply refused to know when it was beaten. But before the sun sets on this ridge, before we count the cost of glory, we must return to the beginning. We must see the gathering storm. To comprehend the savagery of Albuera, one must first cast one's eye across the map of Europe in the spring of 1811. It was a map painted almost entirely in the imperial blue of France, from the freezing steppes of the east to the sun-baked coast of Lisbon. The will of one man dominated the continent. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Corsican tyrant to the British press, or simply the emperor to the millions who lived under his code, was at the zenith of his power. He had humbled Austria, crushed Prussia, and made terms with Russia. The ancient monarchies of Europe, which had stood for centuries, had been swept aside like dry leaves before a gale, replaced by a new order forged in the fires of the French Revolution. Britain stood as the solitary island of defiance, a stubborn rock in a rising French tide. We must remember that for the generation of men who stood in the ranks at Albuera, the fear of Boney was not an abstract geopolitical concern, it was a visceral daily reality. They had grown up watching the signal beacons along the Kentish coast, waiting for the invasion fleet that had only been forestalled by Nelson's triumph at Trafalgar. Yet, while the Royal Navy's wooden walls secured the seas on land, the French war machine was considered invincible. To meet a French column in open battle was, by the common wisdom of the day, to court disaster. However, there was one bleeding wound in Napoleon's side, a festering sore that he himself would later call his Spanish ulcer. In the Iberian Peninsula, the emperor had overreached. By deposing the Spanish king and installing his brother Joseph on the throne, he had ignited a ferocious, chaotic uprising. It was a brutal war of assassination, ambush, and reprisal. The word guerrilla, or little war, entered the English lexicon during these bloody years. It was here, amidst the arid plains and mountain passes of Spain and Portugal, that Britain had chosen to make its stand. 1. The British Army in the Peninsula, under the command of Lord Wellington, was a small, precious instrument. Unlike the French, who could conscript thousands of men from their vast territories to replace their losses, Britain had a volunteer army. Every redcoat lost was a tragedy. Every regiment destroyed was a catastrophe that could not be easily remedied. Wellington knew he had to preserve his army at all costs, fighting only when the ground and the odds were in his favor. He played a dangerous game of cat and mouse, retreating behind the lines of Torres Vedras to save Portugal, then striking out when the French overextended. By the spring of 1811, the tide seemed to be turning. The French Marshal Massena had been driven out of Portugal, his starving army leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. But as the French retreated, they left behind a poisoned Calais, the great fortress of Badajoz. Badajoz was more than just a city of stone walls and cannon, it was the key to the southern corridor between Spain and Portugal. It commanded the main road to Madrid. Whoever held Badajoz held the gateway to the south. The French had secured it through bribery and treachery earlier in the year, and now it sat like a heavy padlock on the door of British ambition. Wellington could not advance into Spain to liberate it while Badajoz remained in French hands, threatening his rear, and so the army was divided. Wellington took the main force north to face the remnants of Massena's army, while a secondary smaller force was detached to the south. Their mission was clear but perilous: lay siege to Badajoz and retake the fortress. This southern corps was a motley collection of troops, British infantry, Portuguese levies, and the unpredictable remnants of the Spanish armies. To command them, Wellington appointed Marshal William Beresford. Beresford was a man of immense physical courage, a giant of a man who could crush a French lancer in his grip, but he lacked the icy strategic detachment of Wellington. He was an administrator, a reorganizer of the Portuguese army, not a master of the chessboard. And he was about to face one of the greatest grandmasters of the age. Marching north to relieve the siege of Badajoz came Marshal Jean de Dieu Soult, the Duke of Dalmatia. Soult was arguably the finest of Napoleon's marshals then in Spain. He was a veteran of Austerlitz and Jena, a man of ruthless ambition and cold, calculating intellect. His soldiers called him Old Fox, and he possessed a towering arrogance, a Gallic pride that led him to view the British as stubborn amateurs and the Spanish as an undisciplined rabble. Soult's objective was simple: smash the Allied army, relieve Badajoz, and drive the British back into the sea. He brought with him the Army of the South, 24,000 seasoned veterans, heavily supported by cavalry and artillery. These were men who had known nothing but victory. They marched with the easy confidence of predators entering a field of sheep. The strategic stakes could not have been higher. If Soult succeeded, he would not only save the fortress, he would drive a wedge between the northern and southern wings of the Allied army. Wellington, caught off balance, might be forced to abandon Portugal entirely. The years of blood and treasure spent by the British government would be wasted, and the hope of European liberation would be snuffed out. The Spanish ulcer would be cauterized, freeing Napoleon to turn his vast armies elsewhere, perhaps towards Russia, or perhaps once again towards the cliffs of Dover. It was a collision of immense consequence. On one side, the professional, battle-hardened machine of Imperial France, led by a marshal seeking to burnish his own legend. On the other, a fragile coalition plagued by bickering generals, poor supplies, and the terrible weather of the Spanish Spring. As Soult's columns wound their way through the olive groves and dusty tracts of Extremadura, the Allied forces scrambled to meet him. They lifted the siege of Badajoz and moved to a blocking position, a ridge of high ground near the obscure village of Albuera. It was not a perfect defensive position, far from it, but it was the only ground available. The stage was set for a tragedy. The pieces were moving into place for a confrontation that would not be decided by brilliant maneuvers or clever feints, but by the raw, grinding capacity of men to endure punishment. The political machinations of London and Paris, the dreams of emperors and kings, had all narrowed down to this: a muddy ridge, a rainy morning, and the question of whether a line of redcoats could stand against the weight of an empire. But wars are not fought by maps, they are fought by men. And to understand the spirit that would meet Marshal Soult on that ridge, we must turn our gaze from the generals and marshals to the men they commanded. Specifically, we must look to a quiet, unassuming officer of the 57th Regiment, a man whose name was unknown to the public, but who carried within him the ancient, stubborn martial code of the British infantry. In the popular imagination, the Napoleonic officer is often a figure of dashing romance, a cavalryman in a frog jacket, perhaps a hussar with a pelisse slung carelessly over one shoulder, dancing at the Duchess of Richmond's ball before riding out to glory. It is an image cultivated by the portraits of the era and the novels of a later age. But the reality of the Peninsular War, the war that actually ground down the French Empire, was not fought by dandies on thoroughbred horses. It was fought and ultimately won by men like Lieutenant Colonel William Inglis. Inglis was, in every respect, the antithesis of the aristocratic amateur. He was a soldier of the line, a man who had not bought his way to glory with a vast inheritance, but had climbed the ladder of promotion through the slow, grinding accumulation of years and merit. Born into a Scottish family, the son of a surgeon, he carried the quiet, dour resilience of his ancestors. He had joined the 57th Regiment of Foot in 1781, a full 30 years before the events at Albuera. To put that into perspective, when William Inglis first donned the red coat, the American colonies were still in rebellion, and Napoleon Bonaparte was a mere schoolboy in Brienne. For 3 decades, Inglis had served the same regiment. He had been a subaltern, a captain, and a major, living the peripatetic, often monotonous life of the peacetime army. He had seen service in the West Indies, that graveyard of the British Army, where fever killed more men than muskets ever did. He had survived the boredom of garrison duty and the rigors of campaign. By 1811 he was 47 years old. By the standards of the day, for a field officer commanding infantry, he was an old man. He was not there for the glamour, he was there because soldiering was his profession, his trade, and his life. There was a profound difference between the Guards regiments, the household troops who protected the king and were filled with the sons of the highest nobility, and the line regiments like the 57th. The 57th, designated the West Middlesex, was a working man's regiment. Its officers were often the younger sons of the gentry or professional men, those who could not afford the exorbitant prices for commissions in the cavalry or the Guards. They were serious men who studied their drill manuals and understood that their career prospects depended entirely on their competence. And what of the men they led? To understand the miracle of Albuera, one must look into the faces of the rank and file of the 57th. The Duke of Wellington, in a moment of aristocrat frustration, once famously referred to his army as the scum of the earth. It is a quote often taken out of context, for he added that it was truly wonderful what fine fellows battle made of them. The men of the 57th were drawn from the taverns of London, the ploughs of Middlesex, and the desperate corners of a Britain in the throes of the Industrial Revolution. They were men who had taken the king's shilling often as an escape from the drudgery of the factory, the spectre of the poorhouse, or the long arm of the law. They were hard men, accustomed to a life of physical hardship that we can scarcely imagine today. They were illiterate, rough-edged, and fond of drink when they could find it. In the eyes of polite society back in England, they were dangerously close to criminals. But in the hands of a man like William Inglis, they were transformed. The mechanism of this transformation was the unique, peculiar alchemy of the British regimental system. A regiment was not merely an administrative unit. It was a tribe, a family, and a distinct nation unto itself. It possessed its own customs, its own history, and its own flag, the colors. Discipline in the British Army of this era was undeniably harsh. The shadow of the cat o' nine tails loomed large, and flogging was the standard punishment for everything from theft to insubordination. It was a brutal system reflective of a brutal age, yet fear of the lash alone cannot explain why men would stand firm in the face of canister shot. Fear dissipates when death is imminent. Terror makes men run, not stand. What held the 57th together was something more profound, something that Colonel Inglis cultivated with every inspection and every march. It was esprit de corps. It was the belief that the 57th was superior to the 56th or the 58th. It was the intense, brotherly bond formed between men who slept on the same hard ground, shared the same moldy biscuit, and endured the same miseries of the campaign trail. Inglis was the patriarch of this rugged family. He was not a distant figure viewing the battle through a telescope. He was a field officer in the truest sense. He walked amongst them. He knew the names of his sergeants. He knew which companies were steady and which were skittish. His authority was absolute, but it was underpinned by a mutual compact. The men knew that the old man would not ask them to step where he would not step himself. He ensured they were fed before he ate. He ensured their billets were dry before he slept. In return, he demanded their absolute obedience and their lives. By the spring of 1811, the 57th had been hardened by the Peninsula. They looked nothing like the pristine soldiers of the recruitment posters in London. Their red coats were faded to a dusty pink or patched with brown cloth. Their shakos were battered, their trousers stained with the mud of Portugal and Spain. They were lean, sun-blackened, and lice-ridden, but their muskets, the famous Brown Bess, were kept spotless, the locks oiled and the flints sharp. They marched with a swinging, rhythmic cadence that could eat up 20 miles a day. They were, largely unbeknownst to their enemies and perhaps even to themselves, the finest heavy infantry in the world. However, as they marched towards Albuera, the 57th was not a full-strength battalion. Sickness, the constant companion of war, had whittled their numbers down. It is a negligible force. Yet, the placement of these specific 50-70 men would decide the fate of the campaign. Inglis must have felt the weight of the coming storm. The intelligence reports were grim. Marshal Soult was moving with overwhelming force. The 57th was part of a brigade commanded by Major General Daniel Haughton, another solid, reliable officer. They were placed in the reserve, behind the Spanish lines. The logic was sound. The Spanish would absorb the initial skirmishing, and the British infantry would be preserved for the decisive moment. But war rarely follows the logic of the planning tent. As the rain began to fall on the night of the 15th of May, soaking the men to the bone as they huddled in their bivouacs without fires, there was a sense of foreboding. The men of the 57th checked their priming pans, wrapping the locks of their muskets in rags to keep the powder dry. They gnawed on hard tack and salted beef, sharing grim jokes in the darkness. Inglis would have been moving among the companies, his presence a reassuring anchor in the gloom. He represented continuity, he represented the regiment. For many of the young recruits who had filled the gaps left by fever victims, the colonel knew that the battle to come would not be a contest of maneuver. The terrain at Albuera did not favor it, and the enemy was too aggressive. It would be a trial of strength. It would be a question of who could endure the most punishment. He knew the reputation of the French infantry, their speed, their ferocity, their ability to swarm over a static defense. He knew that if the 57th were called upon, they would have to function not as individuals, but as a single, unbreakable block. It is worth pausing to consider the mind of a man like Inglis on the eve of destruction. He had no wife or children waiting for him in the baggage train. The regiment was his life's work. To see it broken, or worse, disgraced by cowardice, would be a fate worse than death. The honor of the regiment was not an abstract concept to a Victorian or Georgian gentleman. It was a tangible asset, more valuable than gold. It was this intense, singular focus on duty that he had bred into his officers and men. As dawn broke gray, wet, and miserable, the 57th stood to arms. They shook out their stiff limbs, fixed their bayonets with a metallic clatter that rippled down the line, and waited. They were the West Middlesex. They were the king's hard bargain, and they were about to walk into a fire that would consume them, and in doing so, immortalize them. The trap that Marshal Soult had laid was about to spring. The tactical chessboard, which had seemed so stable the night before, was about to be upended by a failure of command and the ruthless brilliance of the French marshal. The 57th were merely pawns in this game, but they were pawns made of iron. If the Duke of Wellington was the cold, calculating intellect of the Peninsular Army, the Grand Master moving pieces with dispassionate precision, then Marshal William Beresford was its sheer brute physical force. But in the cruel calculus of war, muscle without the coup d'oeil, the stroke of the eye, that innate ability to read a battlefield at a glance, is a liability. As the Allied army shivered in the damp twilight of May 15th, the fate of the campaign rested not in the hands of the Iron Duke, who was miles away in the north, but with Beresford, a man who was an excellent administrator, a fierce fighter, but a dangerously hesitant general. Beresford was a man of immense stature, a giant who would, in the heat of the coming battle, physically grapple with a French lancer and unhorse him with his bare hands. He had done wonders reorganizing the Portuguese army, turning a rabble into fighting men. But he possessed a fatal flaw. He lacked the imagination to see what his enemy was seeing. He looked at the map and saw only what he expected to see, not what was actually there, and what he expected was a frontal assault. To understand the tragedy that was about to unfold, we must look at the stage upon which this bloody drama was to be enacted. The village of Albuera sits on a low ridge, overlooking a small river of the same name. It is not a dramatic landscape. There are no towering cliffs or deep ravines to anchor a defense. It is a series of gentle, undulating hills covered in olive groves and scrub oak. It is a deceptively open terrain, the kind of ground that invites movement. Beresford deployed his army, a mixed force of British, Portuguese, and Spanish troops along this ridge. He placed the British 2nd Division in the center, astride the main road from Badajoz to Seville. This was the logical, conventional place for them. He assumed that Marshal Soult, coming up that road, would try to smash through the village and cross the bridge. It was a by-the-book deployment for a by-the-book commander. However, to the right of the Allied line, the ground rose to a broad, flat-topped hill. This was the key to the entire position. If an enemy could seize that height, they could place cannon there and fire down the length of the Allied line an enfilade fire that would tear the army to pieces. Beresford, belatedly realizing the importance of this ground, asked the Spanish general, Joaquin Blake, to occupy it. But there was a subtle, treacherous feature to this landscape that Beresford had missed, and which his opponent, the old fox, Soult, had spotted instantly. Beyond the Allied right flank, hidden from view by the roll of the land and the thick woods of olive trees, was a re-entrant, a depression in the ground that could conceal the movement of thousands of men. Marshal Soult, peering through his telescope from the other side of the river, must have smiled. He saw the flaw immediately. Beresford was guarding the front door, leaving the side window wide open. The British commander had deployed his army to fight a static defensive battle against a frontal assault. Soult, however, had no intention of playing Beresford's game. The weather, too, conspired against the British. The spring of 1811 had been wet, but the night of the 15th brought a deluge. The rain fell in sheets, turning the tracks into quagmires and the streams into torrents. But more importantly, it brought a thick, cloying mist. This was not merely a dampener on morale, it was a cloak of invisibility for the French. As the British soldiers huddled under their sodden blankets, trying to shield their muskets from the damp, they could hear the sounds of the French army across the valley. They heard the rumble of wheels, the neighing of horses, and the distant murmur of thousands of men. But the mist distorted the sound. Beresford, listening anxiously from his headquarters, believed the French were settling in for the night, or perhaps preparing to attack the bridge at dawn. He was wrong. Under the cover of that drumming rain and swirling fog, Marshal Soult was moving his pieces with terrifying speed. He left a small force go to Knott's brigade and some cavalry facing the village of Albuera to make noise and create a diversion. This was the bait. Meanwhile, the bulk of his army, the crushing weight of his infantry corps, the terrifying Vistula lancers, and his heavy artillery began a silent, forced march to the left. They moved through the dead ground, slipping through the woods, circling like a pack of wolves moving downwind of the flock. Their target was not the village. It was that exposed, isolated right flank where the Spanish troops were sleeping. It is chilling to consider the confidence of the French army that night. They were veterans who had seen the backs of Austrian, Prussian, and Russian armies. They held the British in grudging respect but viewed the Spanish with utter contempt. They knew that if they could get onto that ridge, they could roll up the Allied line like a wet carpet. They marched in silence, the wheels of their cannons wrapped in straw to deaden the noise, the commands whispered by sergeants. It was a masterpiece of maneuver warfare. Back on the ridge, the mood was somber. The 57th, lying in the mud with the rest of Haughton's brigade, were positioned behind the center. They were the reserve. In Beresford's mind, their role would be to plug any gaps if the French broke through the village. They had no idea that they were currently facing the wrong way. The danger was not in front of them. It was gathering like a thunderhead to their right. General Blake, commanding the Spanish, was a proud man, but his troops were exhausted and starving. They had been marching for days and had only just arrived on the position. They were deployed in a thin line on the high ground, but they were not dug in. They had no idea that 20,000 Frenchmen were assembling mere hundreds of yards away, hidden by the trees and the fog. As the gray light of dawn began to bleed through the mist on the 16th of May, the trap was fully set. Beresford rode out to inspect his lines, still convinced that the attack would come at the center. And Soult, the master manipulator, obliged him. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the French guns opened fire on the village of Albuera. Godinot's infantry rushed the bridge, their drums beating the pause to charge. It was a ferocious assault, loud and conspicuous. Beresford saw the attack and felt a surge of relief. His prediction was correct. The enemy was attacking exactly where he had planned to fight them. He began to feed reinforcements into the village, stripping units from other parts of the line to hold the bridge. He was taking the bait, hook, line, and sinker. The noise of the battle at the bridge was deafening. Smoke billowed up, mixing with the mist. The British and Portuguese defenders in the village fought tenaciously, holding the French at the riverbank. For a brief hour, it seemed as though this would be the battle, a grim, stationary, slugging match over a stone bridge. But then, a rider came galloping from the right flank. A breathless aide-de-camp, mud-spattered and wide-eyed, brought news that turned Beresford's blood to ice. The French were not just at the bridge. The aide reported that pickets on the far right, the flank Beresford had thought secure, had seen movement in the woods. Not a skirmish line, but a forest of bayonets. The mist had lifted momentarily, revealing the terrifying truth. Soult's entire main body, his heavy infantry columns and his cavalry reserves, were already on the British side of the river. They were not attacking the village. They were already on the flank. They were perpendicular to the Allied line. If the Spanish broke, Soult would be behind the British army. Panic, cold and sharp, must have seized the Allied headquarters. Beresford tried to react. He sent frantic orders to General Blake to pivot his Spanish line to face the new threat. But maneuvering an army in the middle of a battle, under fire with a language barrier, is a nightmare scenario. Blake, stubborn and confused, initially refused to believe the order, thinking it was a British attempt to undermine his authority. He delayed. Those precious minutes of delay were the final turning of the screw. While the generals argued and the aides galloped through the mud, the French trap sprung shut. Out of the mist on the right, the French 5th Corps emerged. They came on in massive columns of division, deep formations designed to punch through a line by sheer weight of numbers. In front of them rode the Polish lancers, their pennons fluttering, their lance tips seeking blood. The Spanish troops, caught changing formation, were hit by a sledgehammer. They fought bravely, far more bravely than history often gives them credit for, but they were in a hopeless position. They were being attacked from a direction they had not anticipated by a force that vastly outnumbered them. In the center, the men of the 57th heard the roar of battle shift. They heard the cannon fire not from the village in front of them, but from the hills to their right. They saw the staff officers galloping frantically. The order came down the line. "Stand to!" Colonel Inglis would have mounted his horse, his face grim. He knew what that shift in noise meant. The battle was not going according to plan. The regiment was ordered to wheel to turn 90 degrees to the right. It is a difficult maneuver to perform on a parade ground, in knee-deep mud. With the sound of disaster approaching, it is a test of supreme discipline. The 57th, along with the rest of the British infantry, began to march towards the sound of the guns. They were marching uphill, into the fog, towards a disaster that had already happened. They were walking into a battlefield where the enemy already held the high ground, where the Allies were already routing, and where the air was thick with the scent of catastrophe. Beresford's gamble, his reliance on a conventional defense, had failed. The trap had been set with the precision of a master hunter, and the Allied army had walked directly into it. Now, strategy was useless. Tactics were secondary. The saving of the army would not come from the genius of its general, for his plans lay in ruins. It would come down to the only currency the British army had left to spend, the blood of its infantry. As the 57th crested the rise, leaving the relative safety of the valley floor, the full scale of the horror revealed itself to them. The diehards were about to step onto the stage of history, not as conquerors, but as the last, desperate hope of a broken army. The storm that broke over the ridge of Albuera at 9 o'clock that morning was not merely atmospheric, it was a collision of empires. When the mist finally tore apart, shredded by the wind and the concussive force of the artillery, the true horror of the Allied position was laid bare. On the right flank, the Spanish troops under General Blake were fighting for their lives. We must give credit where it is due. History has often been unkind to the Spanish soldier in this war, painting him as unreliable or skittish. But here, on this muddy, blood-slicked slope, they stood their ground with a desperate courage. They were being hammered by the full weight of Marshal Soult's 5th Corps' nearly 8,000 French infantrymen, moving in heavy columns that acted like a battering ram against the thin, wavering Spanish line. The physics of the engagement were terrifyingly simple. The French columns, deep and dense, possessed a kinetic energy that threatened to simply push the Spanish off the hill by sheer weight of numbers. The Spanish fired, they shouted, they died where they stood, but they were slowly, inexorably being bent backward. They were the hinge of the army, and the hinge was screaming under the pressure. If it snapped, the road to the rear would be open, and the British army would be trapped against the river with nowhere to run. It was into this deteriorating crisis that the 1st British Infantry were thrown. This was not yet our protagonists, the 57th, but the brigade of Lieutenant Colonel John Colborne. To understand the miracle of what the die-hards would achieve later, we must first witness the catastrophe that befell Colborne's men. It serves as the grim prologue, the bloody evidence of just how impossible the odds truly were. Colborne's brigade consisted of 3 proud regiments, the 3rd Foot, the famous Buffs, the 48th, and the 66th. Leading the division was Major General William Stewart. Stewart was a man of fire and aggression, a soldier who believed that the solution to any tactical problem was to close with the enemy and bayonet him. Seeing the Spanish buckling, Stewart did not wait to form a defensive line. He did not wait for support. He ordered Colborne's brigade to advance uphill, in line, to hit the flank of the French column. It was a bold, aggressive maneuver, typical of the offensive spirit of the British Army, and initially it worked magnificently. The British Redcoats crested the rise and poured a devastating volley into the flank of the French infantry. The French, packed tightly in their columns, could not return fire effectively. They staggered. The British cheered a raw, throaty roar of triumph and charged forward with the bayonet. The French wavered. For a fleeting, intoxicating moment, it looked as though a disaster had been averted by sheer British pluck. It seemed the battle was won. But the gods of war are fickle, and at Albuera the weather was a French ally. Just as Colborne's men were advancing, flushed with the heat of victory, the skies darkened to a bruising purple. A squall of rain, heavier than anything seen that morning, swept across the ridge. It was accompanied by hailstones the size of musket balls that rattled against the shakos and stung the faces of the men. In that sudden, blinding downpour, visibility dropped to 0. The powder in the pans of the muskets turned to useless black paste. And through the roar of the wind and the hail, a new sound emerged, a rhythmic, thundering tremor in the earth. Approaching the British right flank, unseen and unheard until the final second, was the cavalry of the Vistula Legion. These were not ordinary horsemen. They were Poles, exiles fighting for Napoleon in the hope of restoring their lost nation. They were armed with lances, long, razor-tipped spears that gave them a terrifying reach advantage over a man with a bayonet. They wore distinctive uniforms with square-topped tabka hats, which, in the gloom and the rain, looked confusingly similar to the shakos worn by the Spanish allies. The tragedy happened in a heartbeat. The British officers, peering through the squall, saw horsemen galloping towards their open flank. Thinking they were Spanish cavalry coming to support the attack, orders were shouted down the line. "Hold your fire! They are our friends! Don't fire!" The men of the Buffs and the 66th lowered their muskets. They watched the horsemen approach, waiting for a wave or a salute. Instead, they received the lance. The Vistula Lancers crashed into the exposed flank of Colborne's brigade with the force of a tidal wave. Because the British were deployed in a long, thin line to fight infantry, they were utterly vulnerable to cavalry. They had no time to form a square, the bristling hedgehog formation that was the only defense against horsemen. They were caught in line, the worst possible formation to receive a cavalry charge. It was not a battle, it was a massacre. The Lancers rolled up the British line like a piece of paper. The sheer momentum of the horses knocked men flying, trampling them into the mud. The long lances skewered men before they could even raise their bayonets to defend themselves. Panic, sharp and infectious, tore through the ranks. In the space of minutes, perhaps 10, perhaps less 3 of the finest regiments in the British Army were effectively annihilated. The 3rd Foot, the Buffs, lost nearly 85% of their strength. Their king's color and regimental color were seized by the French, the ensigns carrying them hacked down in a flurry of saber cuts. The 66th suffered a similar fate. The field was strewn with redcoats, trampled into the mire by the hooves of the Polish horses. Only the 31st Regiment, on the far left of the brigade, managed to form a hasty square and survive, a lonely island of resistance in a sea of carnage. The psychological impact of this disaster cannot be overstated. From the headquarters in the rear, Beresford watched in horror as an entire brigade simply evaporated. He saw the French Lancers, drunk with blood and victory, galloping freely across the rear of his army, spearing the wounded and chasing the fugitives. He saw the French infantry, emboldened by the destruction of the British, surge forward again with renewed "Vive l'Empereurs." The French commander, Marshal Soult, must have lowered his telescope with a satisfied nod. He had outmaneuvered the British. He had smashed their right flank. He had destroyed a brigade in minutes. The road to Badajoz was open. The Leopards were not just beaten, they were broken. The fog of war is a cliché, but on that ridge, it was a terrifying reality. The smoke from the muskets mixed with the rain and the mist to create a twilight world where friend and foe were indistinguishable until the killing blow was struck. The air was filled with the chaotic noise of defeat. The screams of men crushed by horses, the high-pitched rallying calls of the buells that went unanswered, and the relentless drumming of the French pas de charge. For the remaining British troops, those held in reserve, the sight of the survivors of Colborne's brigade stumbling back through the smoke must have been chilling. These were men they had messed with, men they had marched with. Now they were shattered remnants, their eyes wide with the trauma of the lance, their uniforms torn and bloody. This was the context, the grim reality, into which the 57th Regiment was now called. The disaster of Colborne's brigade had left a gaping hole in the center of the Allied line. The French columns were reforming, preparing to march through that gap and finish the job. There was nothing left to stop them. The Spanish were exhausted and out of ammunition. The cavalry was scattered. The artillery was being overrun. The only fresh unit available, the only card Beresford had left to play, was Haughton's brigade, and the backbone of Haughton's brigade was the 57th. As the order came to advance, Colonel Inglis and his men would have walked past the carnage of the previous half hour. They would have seen the bodies of the Buffs and the 66th. They would have seen the Lancers regrouping in the distance, their lance tips red with British blood. They knew exactly what had happened. They knew that the invincible British line had been smashed. Most men, witnessing such a catastrophe, would have been shaken. Their morale would have cracked. They would have looked at the massive French columns ascending the hill columns that had just devoured 3 regiments, and they would have felt the icy grip of fear. But the 57th did not stop. They did not waver. They tightened their grip on their muskets. The drummers beat the long, rolling cadence of the advance. The hammer blow had fallen. The British army had been brought to its knees. Now, as the storm clouds bruised the sky above them, it was time for the anvil to prove its worth. The French believed the battle was won. They believed there was nothing left on that ridge that could stand against them. They were wrong. The destruction of Colborne's brigade had torn the heart out of the Allied center. In the smoke-choked vacuum left by the slaughter of the Buffs and the 66th, A terrible silence descended, a momentary, gasping pause in the cacophony of battle, broken only by the cries of the wounded and the triumphant, baying roar of the French columns regrouping for the final kill. From the perspective of Marshal Soult, looking down from his saddle through the lifting mist, the battle was effectively over. He had smashed the British right, he had scattered the Spanish, and now the path to the ridge's crest lay open. All that remained was to march his victorious infantry forward, sweep away the debris of the Allied army, and claim the day. He must have felt the heavy, satisfying weight of destiny in his hand. The Leopards were not just wounded, they were finished. But in the chaos of the British rear, amidst the panic of fleeing baggage trains and the confusion of terrified aides, a decision was made. It was a decision born not of brilliant strategic calculation, but of a grim, stubborn refusal to accept the reality of defeat. It was the decision to plug the gap. Major General Daniel Haughton, a man of solid, unspectacular competence, received the order. His brigade, consisting of the 29th, the 48th, and our protagonists, the 57th, was the last fresh reserve available. They were the only unbloodied cards left in Beresford's hand. The order was simple, brutal, and to any rational observer, suicidal: advance. The 57th will advance. The command rippled down the line, repeated by the sergeants, those iron-hard men who were the spine of the regiment. The men of the West Middlesex stood up from the wet grass. They shook the water from their shakos, checked their flints one last time, and stepped off. What followed was one of the most harrowing marches in the history of the British Army. It was not a long march, perhaps only a few hundred yards, but it was a journey into the mouth of hell. To reach the firing line, Houghton's brigade had to cross the very ground where Colborne's brigade had just been annihilated. They did not march across a pristine field, they marched through a charnel house. They had to step over the mangled bodies of the Buffs and the 66th. They had to navigate around the thrashing carcasses of horses and the shattered remains of artillery caissons. Imagine for a moment the psychological fortitude required for that movement. These men were not ignorant of what lay ahead. The evidence of the French power was under their boots. Every corpse they stepped over was a silent testament to the ferocity of the enemy they were about to meet. They were walking into the exact same trap that had just snapped shut on their comrades. Yet the 57th kept their dressing. Close up, came the sergeant's growls, ensuring the files remained shoulder to shoulder. This was the discipline of the drill square applied to the abattoir. They marched in a silence that was peculiarly, terrifyingly British. Across the valley, the French watched them come. To the soldiers of the Emperor, this must have been a baffling sight. They were accustomed to enemies who ran when outmaneuvered. They were used to armies that crumbled when their flanks were turned. Yet here, emerging from the smoke of their own defeat, came three solitary red lines, marching with the mechanical precision of automatons. The French columns, by contrast, were a tumult of noise. They advanced with the pause to charge, the drums beating a frantic, blood-pumping rhythm. The officers danced their horses in front of the men, waving swords and shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" The French soldiers, emboldened by their earlier success, were shouting, jeering, a mass of blue coats and brass eagles surging uphill like a rising flood. It was the clash of two distinct military philosophies, the Gallic fury, all passion and momentum, against the British stoicism, all silence and order. Tactically, the confrontation that was about to occur was the classic mismatch of the Napoleonic Wars, the line versus the column. Soult's forces were arranged in deep, heavy columns. This formation was designed for shock. It was a sledgehammer intended to punch a hole through an enemy line by sheer weight of human mass. A column had immense psychological power. To stand in a thin line and watch thousands of men thundering towards you required nerves of steel. However, the column had a fatal mathematical flaw. Only the men in the first 2 or 3 ranks could fire their muskets. The thousands of men behind them were effectively useless in a firefight. They were there only to provide weight and momentum. The British, by contrast, were deployed in a line, 2 ranks deep. Every single man in the regiment could use his weapon. If, and it was a colossal if, the line could hold its nerve and not break before the impact, it could output a volume of fire that the column could not match. It was a contest of firepower versus shock action. As the 57th crested the rise, the full magnitude of the French force was revealed to them. They were facing not a regiment, but a corps. The French outnumbered them by 4, perhaps 5 to 1. The sheer density of the blue uniforms must have filled the horizon. General Haughton, riding at the front of his brigade, waved his hat. He was a conspicuous target, wearing a green frock coat that stood out against the red of his men. He would not survive the day, falling riddled with bullets, but in this moment he led them to the precipice. "Halt!" the command rang out. The 57th stopped. They were now within pistol shot of the French mass, perhaps 60 or 70 yards. The faces of the French soldiers were clearly visible, their mouths open in shouts of defiance, their mustaches bristling. The officers could see the individual regimental numbers on the French shakos. Ready! 500 muskets were brought to the shoulder in unison. The click of the locks being pulled back sounded like the breaking of a dry twig, magnified 500 times. Present, the barrels leveled. The line did not waver. The French column, seeing the red wall settle into a firing position, hesitated for a fraction of a second. The momentum of the charge stuttered. Fire! The volley that erupted from Houghton's brigade was a physical blow. 500 ounces of lead, nearly 30 pounds of soft metal, slammed into the crowded front ranks of the French column. At that range, it was impossible to miss. The front of the French formation simply disintegrated. Men were thrown backward, knocking down those behind them. The vive l'Empereurs were cut short, replaced by the screams of the stricken. The smoke from the volley instantly obscured the view, a thick, sulphurous bank of white fog. Load the 57th, began the drill. Bite the cartridge, pour the powder, ram the ball, return the ramrod, prime. These were movements they had practiced until they could do them in their sleep, until they could do them with hands trembling with adrenaline. But the French were not broken. They were veterans of the Grand Army. They recovered from the shock. The sheer depth of their column meant that for every man who fell, another stepped forward to take his place. They shook themselves out, fanning out from the sides of the column to bring more muskets to bear, and then they returned fire, and so began the duel. Usually, in battles of this era, such a confrontation would last only minutes. One side would deliver a volley, perhaps two, and then charge with the bayonet, or the other side would break and run. Flesh and blood are not designed to stand at 50 paces and exchange volleys of lead. It is contrary to every instinct of survival. But at Albuera, something unnatural happened. Neither side moved. The French, unable to advance because of the withering wall of lead coming from the British line, but too proud and too numerous to retreat, stood their ground and fired back. The British, pinned in place by their orders and their discipline, stood and took it. The 57th was no longer a maneuvering unit. It had become a stationary target. The French fire, initially high and ragged, began to find its range. Bullets thudded into the red line. Men spun around, collapsing into the mud. Gaps appeared in the files. "Close up! Close up!" The sergeants dragged men sideways to fill the holes, shrinking the line but keeping it unbroken. The noise was deafening, a continuous, rolling roar of musketry that drowned out all orders. It was a firefight in the purest, most brutal sense of the word. There was no cover. There were no trees, no walls, no trenches. Just two lines of men standing upright in the rain, murdering each other at point-blank range. The French had artillery support. Grape-shot canisters filled with iron balls began to tear through the British ranks, cutting swaths through the companies. The regimental colors of the 57th, held aloft by the ensigns, became a magnet for fire. One ensign fell. Another stepped forward to take the flag, only to be shot down seconds later. The silk was riddled with holes, the pole was splintered. This was the breach. Houghton's brigade had stepped into the gap, but they were now being ground into dust. They were the cork in the bottle, holding back the entire pressure of Soult's army. And in the center of the line, mounted on his horse, sat Colonel Inglis. He watched his regiment shrinking. He saw the faces of men he had known for years disappear into the gory slush of the ridge. He knew that by all the laws of war they should retreat. They had done their duty. They had checked the advance. To stay here was suicide, but Inglis did not give the order to retire. He sat immobile, a statue of resolve amidst the flying lead. He knew that if the 57th took one step backward, the French would surge forward, and the army would be lost. They had to buy time. They had to buy it with their lives. The contest had ceased to be about tactics. It had ceased to be about generals or marshals. It had become a test of the human spirit. It was a question of which side possessed the greater capacity for suffering. The French were wavering, confused by this enemy that refused to act according to the rules of war. Why did they not run? Why did they simply stand there and die? The crisis of the battle was approaching its zenith. The 57th was bleeding to death. And it was in this moment, as the casualty rates climbed past 50%, that the final, terrible act of the drama would play out. The metal was about to be tested in the hottest part of the fire. The fighting had now dissolved into a realm of violence that defied all rational description. The distance between the two lines had narrowed until it was no longer a battle of maneuver, but a brutal, intimate execution. The smoke, heavy and sulphurous, hung low over the ridge, trapping the combatants in a gray twilight, where the only illumination came from the muzzle flashes of muskets firing at ranges so close that the wadding from the cartridges often singed the uniforms of the enemy. It was here, in this suffocating gloom, that the 57th Regiment of Foot ceased to be a tactical unit and became a legend. The duel was fought at 20 paces. At this distance, the smoothbore musket, usually a weapon of notorious inaccuracy, became terrifyingly precise. Every volley tore through flesh and bone. The air was thick with the buzzing of lead, sounding like a swarm of angry hornets, punctuated by the wet thud of impact and the sharp crack of splintering equipment. The French, crowded into their deep columns, were suffering horribly. The British line, though thin, enveloped the head of their formation, pouring fire into the front and flanks of the French mass. The French soldiers in the rear ranks, unable to see the enemy and maddened by the slaughter of their comrades in front, fired their muskets into the air, or worse, into the backs of their own men. The column became a churning, screaming mob, trapped by its own density. But the 57th was paying a butcher's price for this advantage. They stood in the open, silhouetted against the grey sky, a perfect target for the French artillery that had now unlimbered on the high ground. Grape-shot canisters packed with iron balls the size of plums swept the line with the force of a scythe. It was during one of these murderous discharges that the heart of the regiment was struck. Lieutenant Colonel William Inglis, mounted on his horse, had been a tower of strength, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the frenzy around him. Then the air exploded. A charge of grape shot slammed into his chest. The impact was devastating. It tore through his uniform, shattered his ribs, and collapsed his lung. The force of the blow lifted him from his saddle and threw him into the blood-soaked mud. A collective gasp would have rippled through the nearby companies. To see the old man fall was often the signal for a regiment's resolve to crumble. In the confusion of battle, the loss of the commander breaks the chain of command. It severs the connection between the brain and the body of the battalion. Panic usually follows, then flight. Aides and sergeants rushed to his side, their hands slick with rain and blood, preparing to lift him. The surgeons were in the rear. Perhaps they could save him. Perhaps there was still time. They moved to carry him away from the line of fire. But Inglis, fighting through a pain that we can scarcely imagine, gasping for breath through a chest filled with blood, grabbed the arm of a sergeant. He shook his head. He knew the precipice upon which his regiment stood. He knew that if his men saw him being carried to the rear, they might interpret it as a signal to retreat or lose the will to stand in this hurricane of iron. "No," he wheezed, "I will not go." He ordered them to prop him up. He wanted to be placed in front of the colors, the tattered, bullet-riddled silks that represented the soul of the regiment. He wanted to die with his men. He wanted to die facing the enemy. Propped against the leg of a corporal, or perhaps resting on a knapsack, half-seated in the mire, Inglis watched his regiment melting away. He saw the gaps in the line where whole files had been swept away by cannon fire. He saw the young faces of recruits, white with terror, looking for an anchor in the storm. And then he gave them that anchor. He raised his voice, a voice now bubbling with the fluid in his lungs, and shouted the order that would echo down the centuries. "Die hard, 57th, die hard." It was a command of terrifying simplicity. He was not asking them to charge. He was not asking them to perform a complex maneuver. He was asking them to endure. He was appealing to their pride, to their stubbornness, to the hard-bitten honor of the British infantryman. He was telling them that survival was secondary to duty. And the 57th answered him. They did not break. Instead, they performed a feat of discipline that is almost incomprehensible to the modern mind. As men died, the survivors did not cower or scatter. They stepped inward. Close up, the sergeants, walking behind the line with their pikes leveled to prevent any man from stepping back, grabbed soldiers by the shoulders and shoved them into the gaps left by the dead. The line shrank. It contracted like a muscle under tension. What had been a formation of over 500 men was whittled down to 400, then 300, then 2. Yet the volley fire never stopped. Load, present, fire. The mechanical rhythm continued, slower now as fatigue set in and ramrods became fouled with soot. But it never ceased. The men of the 57th were stepping over the bodies of their friends to maintain the alignment. They were standing in pools of blood, sliding in the gore, yet they kept their dressing. It became a triumph of training over biology. Every instinct in the human brain screams to run from death. But the drill, the relentless months of repetition on the parade grounds of England, took over. The soldier ceased to be an individual. He became a component of the regiment. As long as the colors flew, as long as the colonel watched, and as long as the man next to him stood, he would stand too. The French were astounded. They had fired enough lead into this red line to destroy a division. They saw the British ranks thinning, seeing the redcoats heaped in piles on the grass. By all rights, the British should have fled 20 minutes ago. Why were they still firing? What manner of men were these? The die-hards were now fighting in a trance of exhaustion and adrenaline. The barrel of a Brown Bess musket gets hot enough to blister skin after rapid firing. The men's hands were burned and blackened. Their faces were masks of soot, sweat, and rain, with only the whites of their eyes showing. They were deafened by the roar, parched by the gunpowder smoke, and surrounded by the groans of the dying. Casualties in some companies reached 60, 70, eventually 75%. Captains fell, replaced by lieutenants. Lieutenants fell, replaced by ensigns. Ensigns fell, and sergeants took command. In some sections, privates were commanding privates. Yet still, the French column could not move forward. The sheer volume of fire from the 57th and the other regiments of Haughton's brigade acted as an invisible barrier. The French front ranks were simply being erased as fast as they could form. The dead piled up in a rampart between the two armies, a gruesome barricade that neither side could cross. Marshal Soult, watching from the distance, must have been seized by a cold realization. He had committed his reserves. He had launched his hammer blow. He had achieved surprise and local superiority. And yet, his grand army was being stopped by a thin, red thread that simply refused to snap. The psychological balance of the battle began to shift. The French soldiers, for all their bravery, began to lose heart. They were fighting ghosts, men who should be dead but kept firing. The momentum of the French attack, which relies so heavily on confidence and dash, evaporated in the face of this silent, grinding resistance. Inglis, his vision likely blurring from blood loss, watched it all. He watched his regiment die and in dying achieve immortality. He saw the impossible odds neutralized not by a clever general but by the refusal of the common soldier to accept defeat. The duel in the smoke had lasted for perhaps 45 minutes, an eternity in combat. The 57th was no longer a battalion. It was a cluster of survivors standing around their tattered flags. But they were still firing. They were still closing the files. They were still dying hard. And then, through the smoke and the rain, a new sound was heard. Not the roar of the French, but the rhythmic, heavy tread of fresh boots. The crisis had reached its breaking point, and the scales of fate were about to tip one final time. The 57th had held the door open just long enough. Help was coming. The clock had ticked past the hour of slaughter. On the ridge, the 57th Regiment was no longer a fighting unit in the conventional sense. It was a jagged, bleeding remnant, a thin red scar on the hillside that refused to fade. They had held the pass. They had bought the time Colonel Inglis had asked for. The time is a finite currency in war, and the 57th was bankrupt. Their ammunition pouches were empty, their officers were dead or dying, and the physical limits of human endurance had been reached. Marshal Soult, peering through the lifting smoke, sensed the moment. The British fire was slackening. The die-hards were finally dying out. He prepared to order his massive reserves forward to sweep the debris of the British army into the Albuera River. Beresford, the Allied commander, shaken by the destruction of Colborne's brigade and the carnage he witnessed, was already writing orders for a general retreat. He had mentally conceded the battle. The fortress of Badajoz would remain French. The campaign was lost. But battles are not always decided by the generals who command them. Sometimes they are decided by a sudden, unauthorized spark of initiative in the heat of the moment. Riding near the rear was a young staff officer, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Hardinge. He held no command over the troops. He was a mere Portuguese liaison officer. By the strict hierarchy of the army, he had no right to issue orders to a general. But Hardinge saw what Beresford did not. He saw that the French were crowded, confused, and shaken by the stubborn resistance of the 57th. He saw that they were a coiled spring that had lost its tension, and he saw the 4th Division. General Lowry Cole's 4th Division had just arrived on the field. They were fresh. They had not yet fired a shot. They stood in reserve, watching the slaughter, waiting for the order that Beresford was too paralyzed to give. Hardinge rode up to General Cole. In a moment that would alter the course of the Peninsular War, he practically ordered Cole to advance immediately. It was a breach of protocol that could have led to a court-martial had it failed. But Cole, a fighting general, saw the wisdom in it. He gave the nod. And so, the Fusilier Brigade began to move. This was the elite of the reinforcements, the 7th Royal Fusiliers and the 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers. These were regiments with histories as old as the standing army itself. As they stepped off, marching in echelon, a staggered formation like a flight of stairs, they presented a sight of terrifying, pristine order against the backdrop of the chaotic battlefield. To reach the enemy, they had to march obliquely up the hill, flanking the very spot where the 57th lay in their blood. The Fusiliers marched in silence. There was no shouting, no cheering. There was only the rhythmic thud of thousands of boots hitting the sodden turf in unison, a sound like a great slow heartbeat. The French, still locked in their deadly embrace with the remnants of Haughton's brigade, suddenly realized that the game had changed. Through the smoke on their left flank, they saw a new line emerging. A line that was endless, perfectly dressed, and advancing with the inexorable cold certainty of a tide coming in. Soult tried to react. He screamed orders to his reserves to wheel around, to face this new threat. French guns spun on their axles, pouring grape shot into the advancing Fusiliers. Men in the ranks of the 7th and 23rd began to fall, but the gaps were filled instantly. The line did not stop. It did not even slow down. The historian William Napier, who fought in this war, later wrote of this moment with a prose that touches the sublime. He described the Fusiliers as advancing with a measured tread that shook the ground. They were the personification of the British infantry's greatest strength, a disciplined silence that was more intimidating than any war cry. As they closed the range, the French turned their muskets on the newcomers. A volley ripped into the Fusiliers. The impact was heavy. The 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers took significant casualties. But the survivors stepped over the dead, closing the distance to pistol shot. And then the Fusiliers halted. The command was given. Make ready, present, fire. Because they were in line, and the French were in a dense, confused mass every British musket could bear on a target, the volley that crashed out from the Fusilier Brigade was a thunderclap that shattered the air. It was a rolling, continuous roar of destruction. The French column, which had stood so firm against the 57th, simply dissolved. The lead was flying so thick that the French soldiers could not even raise their muskets to return fire. They were being cut down in swathes like wheat before a summer storm. The flank of the French army was being eaten away by a voracious, unstoppable fire. Soult's veterans, the men who had conquered Europe, looked at this approaching wall of red and realized the impossible truth. They could not stop it. They had exhausted themselves killing the 57th, and now they faced a fresh enemy who fought with the same unnatural robotic discipline. Panic, which had been lurking at the edges of the French formation all morning, now took hold of the center. It started in the rear ranks, the men who could see the Fusiliers closing in but could do nothing to stop them. They began to step back. Then they began to run. The officers struck at the fleeing men with the flats of their swords, trying to stem the tide, but it was like trying to hold back a landslide. The Gallic pride, the arrogance of the invincible Grand Army crumbled. The Fusiliers did not charge with the bayonet immediately. They simply kept walking and firing, walking and firing. They heralded their arrival with a terrible shout, a roar of aggression that finally broke the French will. Suddenly, the great mass of Soult's army, the 20,000 men who had marched to destroy the British, broke. The columns disintegrated into a fleeing mob. They ran down the hill, scrambling over the dead, discarding their muskets, abandoning their wounded. The mighty army of the South was routed. Marshal Soult, watching his plans turn to ash, sat stunned. He later famously remarked, "I had turned their right, pierced their center, and everywhere victory was mine, but they did not know how to run." The Fusiliers stood on the crest of the ridge, the masters of the field. The smoke began to drift away, carried by the wind that followed the rain. The noise of battle faded, replaced by the receding cheers of the victors and the pitiful cries of the maimed. They had won. Against all logic, against all tactical probability, the British line had held, and the British reserve had struck the killing blow. But as the adrenaline faded, the Fusiliers looked around them. They looked at the ground they had just recaptured, and there, amidst the debris of war, they saw the cost of the victory. They saw the place where the 57th had stood. It was a scene of horror that hardened soldiers would weep to recall years later. The 57th were lying in rows, as if they had been cut down by a giant scythe while standing at attention. The dead and the living were piled together. In the center of the heap, still propped up, still breathing the bloody air of victory, was Colonel Inglis. The die-hards had kept their promise. They had not surrendered a foot of ground until the Fusiliers arrived. They had been the anvil upon which the French army was broken. The Battle of Albuera was over. The French were in full retreat across the river. Badajoz was safe. Portugal was safe. But the sun was setting on a field that was carpeted with the flower of the British army. The silence that fell over the ridge was heavy, laden with a grief that no victory could assuage. As night fell, the survivors began the grim task of counting the cost. And as the roll calls were read out in the flickering light of the bivouac fires, the silence that followed the names of the 57th was a deafening testament to their sacrifice. The dead of Albuera were buried in shallow graves where they fell, but the spirit of the 57th Regiment did not perish in the Spanish mud. It rose from that carnage to become something far more durable than flesh and bone. It became a legend that would sustain the British Army for nearly 2 centuries. The name Diehards was not merely a nickname, it became the regiment's soul. It was officially granted as a battle honor, emblazoned on their appointments and their colors, but more importantly, it became a standard of behavior. In the Victorian era, when the British Empire spanned the globe, new recruits joining the Middlesex Regiment were told the story of Colonel Inglis and the Ridge, not as a history lesson, but as a warning. They were inheriting a debt of honor. They were told that they belonged to a regiment that did not know how to run. Colonel Inglis survived his terrible wound. He recovered, was knighted, and eventually rose to the rank of lieutenant general. But he was never simply General Inglis. To the end of his days, he was the man of Albuera. At regimental dinners years later, old men with scars would raise their glasses not to the King or the Duke of Wellington first, but to him. When he died in 1835, he was not just a soldier, he was the patriarch of a tribe that had been forged in the fire of his own command. The legacy of the 57th echoes through time. In the trenches of the First World War, at the Battle of the Somme, and in the freezing perimeter of the Chosin Reservoir in Korea, the descendants of the Middlesex Regiment carried that same stubborn, bloody-minded defiance. When situations became hopeless, when ammunition ran low and the enemy closed in, the cry, "Die hard," would still be heard, a ghostly echo of 8011 summoning the courage of the past to stiffen the spines of the present. Albuera remains a paradox in British military history. It was a battle of dubious strategic necessity, fought by a general who made grievous errors in a campaign that dragged on for years. Yet, it is remembered with a reverence reserved for few other engagements. Why? Because it strips war down to its most elemental truth. Strategy, tactics, and logistics are the science of war. But Albuera was the art of the human spirit. It demonstrated that ordinary men, the scum of the earth, as they were so cruelly called, possessed a nobility that rivaled the heroes of antiquity. They did not fight for geopolitics. They did not fight for the balance of power in Europe. They fought for the man standing next to them. They fought because to leave the line was to break the faith. As we look back on them now through the lens of 200 years, it is easy to dismiss their sacrifice as tragic waste. But to do so is to misunderstand them. They were men of their time, bound by a code of honor that viewed cowardice as a fate far worse than death. On that foggy, rain-swept ridge, the 57th Regiment wrote their names in history not with ink, but with the refusal to yield. They remind us that in the darkest of hours, when the odds are impossible and hope seems lost, the human will is the final, unconquerable reserve. They taught the world that a regiment can die, but its spirit can live forever. Die hard, 57th, die hard. And they did, and in doing so, they live forever. They live for. As the sun finally pierced the gloom of that May evening, it did not illuminate a scene of triumph, but an abattoir. The Battle of Albuera has the grim distinction of being, proportionately, the bloodiest battle of the entire Peninsular War. The firing had ceased, but the air was now filled with a sound perhaps more terrible than the cannonade, the low, collective moan of 6,000 wounded men lying amidst the wet grass and the mud. Nowhere was the carnage more concentrated than on the patch of ground held by the 57th Regiment. When the roll was called that evening, a somber ritual lit by the flickering lanterns of the sergeants, the silence that followed each name was deafening. Of the 570 men of all ranks who had marched up the hill that morning, 422 were dead or wounded. That is a casualty rate of nearly 75%. In the annals of military history, units that suffer 30% casualties are considered shattered and usually rendered combat ineffective. The 57th had taken double that and had never taken a backward step. The dead lay in ghastly, perfect lines. They had fallen exactly where they stood in the ranks, creating swaths of red coats that looked, from a distance, like ridges of crimson turf. Colonel Inglis, miraculously, was alive, though his wound was severe. He was carried off the field, his duty done, his name now inextricably bound to the regiment he had saved. When the dispatch reached the Duke of Wellington in the north, detailing the casualty lists, the butcher's bill, the Iron Duke was appalled. Marshal Beresford, overcome by the slaughter and his own near defeat, wrote a despondent report to Wellington, essentially admitting that the army had been ruined. Wellington, with his characteristic pragmatism and eye for morale, returned the letter. "This won't do," he reportedly said. "Write me down a victory." And strategically it was a victory. Marshal Soult had failed. He had not relieved Badajoz. He had not driven the British into the sea. He had been stopped cold by a force he despised. The old fox retreated south, his army battered and his confidence shaken. The southern corridor remained in Allied hands. The Spanish ulcer continued to bleed. Yet, as the survivors of the 57th sat by their fires that night, cleaning the black powder from their faces and bandaging their cuts, there was no cheering. They had won, yes, but they had looked into the abyss. They had bought the safety of Portugal, but they had paid for it with the blood of their brothers. It was a victory, but one so costly that another like it would have destroyed the British army.